Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how much we all love digging into the latest research on productivity and motivation.
Oh, yeah, it's a topic that never gets old.
Right. And so today we're going to be taking a look at this really fascinating podcast transcript.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it tackles this big question that I think a lot of us struggle with. Should we be following our passions or should we be focusing on discipline?
Ah, the age-old debate.
I know, right? And this podcast starts off by making a really strong case for following your interests.
Okay.
It even mentions some research from Stanford University
Well,
that shows people who are genuinely interested in what they're doing tend to be more creative and productive.
that makes sense.
Yeah, have you ever noticed how when you're really absorbed in something you love, time just seems to fly by?
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yeah,
like you get into this flow state where you're completely focused and energized.
exactly. Well, there's actually a neurological explanation for that.
Really?
Yeah. So when we engage in activities that we find interesting, our brains release dopamine.
Dopamine, the feel-good chemical.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And it turns out that dopamine doesn't just make us feel good, it actually enhances our cognitive function.
So it's like a double whammy. You're enjoying yourself and you're actually thinking more clearly and creatively.
Precisely. It's like a positive feedback loop in your brain.
I love that.
But hold on a second, because this podcast doesn't just sing the praises of following your interests.
Okay.
It also warns about the potential pitfalls of relying solely on interest for motivation.
Like, what happens when you just don't feel like doing something, even if it's important?
Exactly. Like, let's say you have a big project due, but you're just not feeling inspired to work on it.
Well, I've been there.
We all have.
Yeah.
And that's where discipline comes in.
Okay, so it's like a backup plan for when a motivation inevitably wanes.
That's a great way to put it. The podcast actually uses that analogy.
I like that.
Yeah. So it's about having the willpower to push through those moments of resistance and stay committed to your goals, even when you're not feeling that initial surge of excitement.
So it's not about forcing ourselves to do things we hate. It's about having that inner strength to stay on track even when things get tough.
Exactly. And you know what? I think this brings up a really important point. We often think of interest and discipline as being these two opposing forces.
Right. You're either driven by passion or you're forcing yourself to do things you dislike.
But maybe it's not that black and white.
Yeah, maybe it's more about finding a balance between the two.
I think so.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that this podcast explores in more detail.
Oh, interesting. I'm curious to hear what they have to say about that.
Well, they introduced this concept called self-determination theory.
Okay, I've heard of that.
Have you?
Yeah, it's all about how we're more likely to be motivated and committed to tasks when they align with our personal values.
Exactly. So even if a task isn't inherently exciting, if it contributes to the larger goal that's meaningful to you, it becomes much easier to tackle.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, like think about it. Have you ever had to do something that you weren't particularly thrilled about, but you knew it was important for your overall well-being?
Oh, all the time. Like going to the gym. I don't always enjoy it while I'm there, but I know it's good for me in the long run.
Exactly. And because you see the value in it, you're more likely to stick with it.
Right. It's not about the immediate gratification. It's about the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And that's what self-determination theory is all about, aligning our actions with our values.
So it's not just about blindly following our interests or rigidly adhering to a set of rules. It's about finding that sweet spot where pattern and discipline intersect.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yay!
And you know what? I think that's a perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's hear it.
So this podcast we're discussing actually delves into some fascinating research that supports this idea of finding a balance between interest and discipline.
Okay, I'm all ears.
For example, they mention a study from Duke University that found that successful people often rely on strong habits and routines to stay focused and productive.
Habits and routines. Interesting. So it's not just about having that initial spark of inspiration. It's about having those systems in place to keep you going even when motivation dips.
Exactly. And you know what?
What?
It kind of reminds me of something else the podcast mentions.
Okay, what's up?
It's about how sometimes those boring everyday tasks can actually be opportunities to cultivate a sense of mindfulness and presence.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, like instead of rushing through the dishes or folding laundry with your mind racing a mile a minute, you can actually use those tasks as a chance to slow down, pay attention to your senses, and be fully present in the moment.
It's like turning those mundane chores into mini meditation sessions.
Exactly. And you know what? It's a really great way to bring more peace and intention into your day.
I love that idea.
Me too. And I think it speaks to the larger point that we've been discussing, which is that finding a balance between interest and discipline is not about denying ourselves joy or becoming a productivity robot.
Right. It's about creating a life that feels both meaningful and enjoyable.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that sometimes those less than thrilling tasks can actually be opportunities for growth and self-discovery.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I feel like I'm already starting to shift my perspective on how I approach my work and my life in general.
Me too.
Uh,
And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. We've got so much more to explore in this podcast transcript.
well, let's dive in. I'm ready for more.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea that the podcast brings up about how successful people aren't necessarily the ones who are always wildly passionate about everything they do.
Wait, really? I always thought passion was the key to success.
I know, right? That's a common belief. But this podcast challenges that notion.
Okay, I'm listening.
They argue that truly successful people are often those who have mastered the art of showing up consistently, even when motivation is low.
So it's more about having that grit and determination to keep going even when you don't feel like it.
Exactly. It's about developing those habits and routines we talked about earlier and committing to the process even when it's not glamorous or exciting.
It's like that saying, success is the sum of small efforts repeated day in and day out.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not to say that passion isn't important,
Right.
but it's often the discipline, the consistency, the ability to push through those moments of resistance that separates those who achieve their goals from those who don't.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's not about waiting for some magical surge of inspiration to strike. It's about creating the conditions for success by developing those habits, routines, and mental discipline.
You got it. And remember, you don't have to overhaul your entire life overnight.
True.
Start by identifying one small area where you could benefit from a little more discipline.
Maybe like committing to 15 minutes of exercise each day, or finally tackling that pile of paperwork that's been looming over me.
Those are great examples. Or maybe it's something even simpler, like making your bed every morning or taking a few minutes each day to meditate.
The point is to choose something manageable and commit to doing it consistently, even when you don't feel like it.
Exactly. And the idea is that those small wins will create a sense of momentum that will spill over into other areas of your life.
It's like building a positive feedback loop. Each time you follow through on a commitment, no matter how small, you're strengthening that discipline muscle and building confidence in your ability to achieve your goals.
And who knows, maybe those small disciplined actions will eventually lead you to discover new passions and interests you never even knew you had.
That's a really exciting thought. So it's not just about achieving those external goals. It's about cultivating a certain mindset, a way of being in the world that empowers us to live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Beautifully said. And I think that's a perfect segue into the final point the podcast makes.
Okay, drum roll, please.
Are you ready for this?
Hit me with it.
Okay, so they asked this really thought-provoking question. What if passion is something we cultivate rather than something we discover?
Hold on. You're saying passion isn't something we find, it's something we create.
That's the idea they're putting forward.
Wow. Okay, that's a mind bender.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But think about it. How often do we go through our days on autopilot, rushing from one task to the next, without really paying attention to what we're doing or how we're feeling?
I'm so guilty of that, especially when I'm feeling stressed or overwhelmed.
Me too. But what if we made a conscious effort to bring more awareness and intention to those everyday moments?
Like how?
Well, what if we approached even the most mundane tasks with a sense of curiosity and openness to see the beauty and the potential in them?
So instead of viewing those tasks as chores, we see them as opportunities to practice mindfulness and cultivate a sense of gratitude.
Exactly. And you know what? I think that's a really powerful way to shift our perspective and start living more intentionally.
I love that. It's like we're taking back control of our lives and choosing to find joy in the present moment.
Absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful message to leave our listeners with. The power to create a fulfilling and meaningful life lies within each of us.
It's not about finding the perfect job, the perfect hobby, or the perfect relationship.
It's about cultivating a mindset of passion and purpose in everything we do.
So well said. And you know what? This conversation has really inspired me to start looking for those opportunities to cultivate passion in my own life.
Me too.
You.
And I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still so much more to explore.
I know. I can't wait to hear what else this podcast has to say.
Me neither. But for now, let's take a little break and come back refreshed and ready for more.
Sounds good to me. You know, one thing I've always struggled with is like how to actually put all this into practice.
Oh yeah, totally. I feel like I get so caught up in the theory of productivity, but then when it comes to actually implementing it in my life,
No, it's hard.
it's tough.
Well, the good news is that this podcast actually offers some pretty practical advice.
Oh, good.
Yeah, one of the things they suggest is time blocking.
Time blocking. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I've heard of it, but I never really tried it.
It's basically just dividing your day into chunks of time and dedicating each chunk to a specific activity.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so like you might have a block for work, a block for exercise, a block for family time, whatever it is that's important to you.
So it's kind of like creating a schedule for yourself.
Exactly. But it's more than just a schedule. It's about being intentional with your time and making sure that you're allocating enough of it to the things that matter most.
I see. This is about prioritizing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the beauty of time blocking is that it can be as flexible or as rigid as you need it to be.
Okay, that's good to know because I'm not really a super structured person.
Me neither.
Oh.
But even if you're not someone who likes to stick to a strict schedule, I think there's still a lot of value in time blocking.
Like how, so, well, even just the act of sitting down and thinking about how you want to spend your time can be really helpful.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I feel like I often just go through my day on autopilot and then I wonder where all the time went.
Totally. And time blocking can help you become more aware of how you're actually spending your time so you can make more conscious choices about how you want to use it.
I like that. It's like taking back control of your day.
Exactly. And another great thing about time blocking is that it can help you identify those little pockets of time that you might not even realize you have.
Oh, yeah, like those 15 minutes here and there.
Exactly. And those little chunks of time can actually be really productive if you use them wisely.
So instead of just scrolling through social media, I could use that time to get a head start on a work project or to read a few pages of a book.
Precisely. And it's amazing how much you can accomplish even in those short bursts of time.
This is making me realize how much time I probably waste without even realizing it.
Well, don't be too hard on yourself. We all do it to some extent. But the good news is that with a little bit of intentionality, we can all become much more efficient with our time.
I love that. And you know what? Speaking of efficiency, the podcast also has some great tips for making those less than thrilling tasks a bit more bearable.
Oh, yeah, like
Well, one of the suggestions is to gamify your chores.
gamify my chores. What does that even mean?
Well, it could be something as simple as setting a timer and trying to beat your previous record.
Oh, okay. I could see that working for me. I'm super competitive.
Me too.
Sure.
Or you could turn it into a competition with your family or roommates.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, like who can fold the laundry the fastest or who can clean the kitchen the most thoroughly.
And then the winner gets bragging rights.
Exactly. It's a fun way to add a little bit of excitement to those everyday tasks.
I like it. And you know what else the podcast suggests?
What's that?
Pairing those tasks with something you enjoy.
Oh, yeah, like listening to music or a podcast while you're doing the dishes.
Exactly. Or maybe lighting a scented candle or brewing a cup of tea to create a more pleasant atmosphere.
I actually already do that. I always listen to podcasts while I'm cleaning.
It definitely makes the time go by faster.
Right. And it can also help you get into a more positive headspace.
I totally agree. And, sometimes it's not even about adding something external. It's simply about shifting your mindset.
Like how so?
Well, instead of viewing those tasks as tedious obligations, try to see them as opportunities to practice focus, improve efficiency, or even cultivate mindfulness.
I never thought about it that way.
For example, when you're washing dishes, instead of just rushing through it, try paying attention to the sensations of the warm water, the smell of the soap, the feeling of the dishes in your hands.
That's a really interesting idea. It's like turning those everyday chores into mini mindfulness exercises.
Exactly. And you know what's really fascinating?
What?
The podcast actually makes the argument that successful people aren't necessarily the ones who are always wildly passionate about everything they do.
Really? I thought passion was the key to success.
That's a common misconception. But the podcast suggests that truly successful people are often those who have mastered the art of showing up consistently, even when motivation is low.
So it's more about having that grit and determination to keep going even when you don't feel like it.
Precisely. And you know what else? It's also about not being afraid to try new things and experiment until you find something that you do enjoy.
Oh, yeah. I love that. I think sometimes we get so caught up in this idea of finding our one true passion that we forget that our interests can evolve over time.
Exactly. And by being open to new experiences, we might just discover hidden talents and passions that we never even knew we had.
I think that's a great message to leave our listeners with.
I agree. So don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone, try new things, and keep exploring until you find something that truly lights you up.
And remember, even if you don't find your one true passion, that's okay too.
Right. It's more about finding joy and meaning in the journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's about recognizing that even the most mundane tasks can be opportunities for growth and self-discovery if we approach them with the right mindset.
I'm so glad we had this conversation. It's really given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And I'm excited to continue exploring these ideas in the next part of our deep dive.
Me too. Let's do it. So we were talking about how successful people aren't always like super passionate about everything they do.
Yeah, it's kind of a mind-blowing concept, right? You would think that passion is the key ingredient.
It's easy to think that.
Right. But this podcast is making a strong case for discipline being just as important, if not more so.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. How many times have you started something with a ton of enthusiasm, but then fizzled out when things got tough?
Oh, all the time. I'm like the queen of unfinished projects.
Me too.
Mm.
And I think that's where discipline comes in. It's that ability to keep going even when you don't feel like it.
It's like having that inner drive that pushes you forward even when the motivation wanes.
Exactly. And you know what else? This podcast makes a really interesting point about how discipline can actually help you cultivate passion.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. When you commit to something and you stick with it, even when it's challenging, you start to develop a sense of mastery.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
And that sense of mastery can be incredibly motivating.
Yeah?
It makes you want to keep learning and growing.
So it's like a positive feedback loop. You start with discipline, and then as you develop your skills and knowledge, you start to feel more passionate about what you're doing.
Exactly.
But-
And I think that's a really empowering message because it means that passion isn't something that's just bestowed upon us.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we can cultivate through hard work and dedication.
I love that.
Yeah.
So even if you're not feeling super passionate about something right now, that doesn't mean you never will.
Right. It just
Right.
means that you might need to put in some effort and build up those skills and that knowledge base.
Hey, who knows? Maybe along the way, you'll discover a passion that you never even knew you had.
Exactly. So I think the takeaway here is that discipline is essential for achieving our goals, and it can actually help us cultivate passion along the way.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah, I think so too.
So to recap, we've learned that following your passions is great, but it's not always enough.
Discipline is essential for pushing through those tough times and staying committed to our goals.
And by cultivating discipline, we can actually create the conditions for passion to flourish.
It's been such a pleasure exploring these ideas with you today.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of motivation and productivity.
Remember, these are just a few ideas to get you started.
The most important thing is to find what works for you.
And keep experimenting until you find that sweet spot between passion and discipline.
That's where the magic happens.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those wheels turning.
We'll see you soon.